Well, good morning. I'm Ann Munn. Welcome to my kitchen and to All Saints Cooks. We could rename this class Mary Ann Can because today we're going to go over several concepts involving home canning. Here's what I hope you learned today. Basic water bath canning to preserve your food, why you must follow instructions to avoid botulism, how to prepare a delicious relish that you can use several ways, and how you can keep track of what you squirreled away for later use. And today I'm following Norm's lead of 2 weeks ago to use eggplant as my main ingredient. So many people know eggplant as the main ingredient in baked dishes like Parmesan and moussaka. Perhaps you know the Sicilian treat called caponata, or maybe you've made involtinis with your eggplant. Well, today I'm going to show you how you can saute your eggplant to make a delicious spread with lots of uses. Now, I'll be giving you lots of information as we go along, and we'll be waiting at different stages for the cooking process to happen. So I'll be shifting between cooking and canning instructions and related information that I want to share with you. This recipe comes from, and it's going to be backwards, of course. This is the complete book of small batch preserving, which is an excellent book, and I write in all my books, so there's all kinds of notes on every page that I have tried. This recipe, as the recipe is that you got sent over email, only makes 2 cups. Well, I'm going to be making this relish for the winter, so I'm doubling the recipe here. If I'm doing this on my own time, I usually triple it because otherwise it doesn't make enough sense to heat up this big canning pot that you see in the background to do 2 cups of anything. So the nice thing about this relish is if you don't want to do hot water bath canning, you don't have to. Make the single recipe, make your 2 cups, and just keep it in the refrigerator. It'll last quite a while, but I think you're going to like it so well that it really won't last very long at all. Now, especially for those of you who are not familiar with canning, please ask questions as you go along. This session is definitely not meant to be a beginner's only time ever to get information about canning. There's some basic reading you should do along the way. And 3 of the books that I treasure, this one is Ball's Complete Book of Home Preserving. Ball makes those wonderful jars that you can sometimes find in the stores, but not right now because they're all sold out. This one is by America's Test Kitchen, and it's called Foolproof Preserving. And another one that I really like is by Rodell, and that's called Stocking Up. And it's a classic for all kinds. Rodell does great stuff for all kinds of gardening and canning and things like that, preserving. But my bookshelf of canning books is about that wide. So these are only 4 of the many books that I do use for canning. Another source, a very good source, is every single state has a home extension service. And you can go online and get all kinds of information. It doesn't have to just be Maryland. You can go to any state. In fact, Cindy and I, and they're the ones who do Master Gardeners, for example, the home extension service. It's what, Cheryl?
It's through a university.
Yes, it's through a university. Now, Cindy and I were very fortunate during COVID. We joined a class that was out of Pennsylvania's home extension service on preserving. And it was great for beginners and also great for people who have some experience in canning. Now, the safety of canning really depends on following the recipe. The entire process is essential for keeping the correct chemical balance between the acid and the base of whatever you're preparing. Do not improvise on the ratio between the fruits and vegetables to the vinegar or whatever other acid is being added. And I'll give you more information on this in a little bit. But right now, we're going to start with preparing our vegetables. Formerly, I chopped all my vegetables by hand. When you're using a lot of veggies, that can be really tedious. Well, then I was given, for Christmas one year, a little chopper as seen on TV. It's a nice little box and had a grid of blades where you put your slices of vegetable in and then you smash down the lid to slice the veggies or dice the veggies into the hopper. Well, that's great, except that I do a lot of canning and I ended up with carpal tunnel syndrome and tendonitis and surgery for both. So I don't do that anymore. Now I rely more on my food processor. And that's what we're going to do today. So the first up is the eggplant. I have the pan heating, and I'm going to process my eggplant. This is just going to be a little noisy, but you'll see how it's done. It's very easy. And I use a julienne blade, which gives you what look like thin French fries.
Marianne?
Yes, ma'am.
You cut up those eggplants that you're putting in there, right? You cut them already.
All I did, Cindy, was I took off the ends.
Because they're small.
Because
wow, they're teeny.
These are teeny. And I'll get into the size bit because the recipe that you have calls for 1 pound of eggplant. And
Okay.
I'll talk more about that. But let me do some of these guys. Be a little noisy. And I put too much in. So let's take this sucker back off. And we'll take the littler guy.
There you go. There we go.
And I'm using, these are eggplant from the garden. Come on, guys. This is a nice long one. We're going to cut that one so it fits in the hopper. So it doesn't matter what kind of eggplant you use, so long as it's fresh. And since the hopper is kind of full right now, I'll show you what we're going to do. We're going to take the vegetable oil, already measured out, into our heated up pan. And we're going to take this eggplant that's already julienned and put it in. These little guys are going to go back through because they didn't get very chopped. And sometimes you'll find others. So what they look like is strands like that, like little French fries. This guy didn't get very well chopped, so we're just going to give him a rough cut. As our oil is heating there. And let it sizzle away. Put our blades back together. I don't know if you can see, but there are little grooves in this, and that's where it's doing the cutting. All right. So now this sucker is a little bit bigger, so I kind of measure it against my feed tube, so I know about how big to make these guys. And I do not peel it. I don't feel there's any need to get rid of the vitamins that are in your eggplant peel. And that's true in a lot of recipes. I just leave the peel on. Gives it some extra texture, keeps in some of those vitamins. Come on, guys. Why are you? All right. Couple more pieces to go in. These are going to cook for about 10 minutes, which is going to give me time to tell you about some other good stuff that you need to know. We have these wonderful strips of eggplant that are in here cooking. Now, you can hear that this water over here is already boiling. So I'm going to turn that down a little bit. But what I have in there are the jars that we're going to be using to can today. Now, if I was doing this on my own and I was doing a triple batch, I would be using mostly pint-sized jars. But because we have a time constraint here, I'm using only the half-pint jars. You know, they hold a cup. And what I do before they go in the canning pot is these are brand new jars and new lids. So I take the lid, and that's going in a pot that I'm going to turn on in a little while, just of water, because these need to get processed as well and really be clean. And here's the other lid. And I save the flat lid. You always have to use new lids, and I'll go into that. But take my finger, even those are brand new lids, and I just run my hand around the top of the edge to make sure that there's nothing chipped, cracked, because if you have to have a perfect seal between this lid and this jar. Otherwise, you're not going to get a food that you can put away for several months. So these two pass, and I'm going to add them to my canning pot. And because the water is already hot, I'm using my little grabbers here and putting them underwater so they get filled with water and will stay there. All right. Now, when you're actually doing the processing, it'll be important to have those back in the water. Okay, so where are we here? Okay, those are 3 great cookbooks. This is the 4th great cookbook. But one of the things I don't like about cookbooks is the descriptors. This recipe, for example, says use a large eggplant. Well, how the heck big is an eggplant? You saw what I had. I had one that I consider to be large. The others were not. So, okay, out of the garden comes a bunch of small ones. How do I know how much to use? Well, I looked up online on what's the average size of a large eggplant. And it said that it's between 12 and 20 ounces. That's a huge range. So what do? You know, it's going to upset the balance if all you use are 12-ounce ones as opposed to using 20-ounce ones. So what I do is I kind of compromise, and I try to use, for this particular recipe, about 1 pound of eggplant. And that's equal to about 4.5 cups once you dice it up, which of course is going to shrink once you put all this in the jars. And we'll give this guy a few stirs along the way. And normally, I would not put a lid on these, but because we are on a timeline, I'm going to cover this lightly, not all the way, and help keep some of the heat in there so that these eggplants will cook a little bit faster today. All right. Oh, and the other reason, okay, since I'm doubling it, this should make about 4 cups. So I'm looking at the camera. And so, but what I put in the water bath are 5 cups because it doesn't hurt to have an extra jar. And if there's some left over that just doesn't fit in the 4 that are getting canned, then I can use that 5th jar and put it in the refrigerator, or go underneath here and grab some more Tupperware to put anything excess. All right. Now, the recipe also calls for chilies. These chilies are not especially hot, except for one of them. So what I'm going to do, and this is what I've done ever since I met Cheryl, because Cheryl is the one who introduced me to all really hot peppers, I'm putting on rubber gloves because I just cannot take the fumes and the heat that gets on my hands, and then sometimes I know, COVID, you keep your mouth covered and your eyes covered. Well, nah, I don't always. So then I get my skin burning. So I'm going to wear a pair of rubber gloves. When I'm doing his really hot peppers, I also wear a paint mask because those fumes after a while just gag me. Doesn't bother me at all if I'm wearing a paint mask. And you can tell when your paint mask is losing its effectiveness when the fumes start getting through. So that's when you throw that one away and you get out another one. So I'm just going to do a rough chop on, it says 4 to 6 peppers. I'm not, or 2 to 3 in your recipe. But so I'm just going to, these are already seeded, and I'm just going to quickly give them a chop because we have some time before it's time for them to go in the eggplant anyway. And of course you try not to cut the rubber glove because then you're defeating the whole purpose of wearing it. So we'll give these a chop. And these are all peppers from the garden. Now he's been very good about not growing habaneros anymore because they were the ones that just give me such a fit. But he did find a pepper that has a similar smoky flavor to it, and it's mild. It's called a habanata, which I'm throwing in here along with some pepperoncinis and 1 hot lemon pepper. You can make this dish as hot as you like, as mild as you like. Just use the right amount, and that's the big deal for keeping track of where your ratio is for your vegetable versus your vinegar.
And the habanero is a hybrid of a habanero.
Okay, did you hear that? Cheryl said that a habanero is a hybrid of a habanero.
So it has the same smokiness flavor.
Well, make sure you're close enough so they can hear you, Cheryl.
Okay, yeah, the habanero is a hybrid of the habanero, but it's mild, but it has the same smoky flavor as the habanero, just not the extreme heat. And you can get them online.
All right, now we're also going to chop up garlic, which is already peeled. And there's not enough of this to actually do this in the food processor, which is why I'm doing it by hand. But there's the good old trick of just smash the garlic a little bit with your knife. Then it makes it just that much easier to chop. Now, if you're putting the salt in at the same time as the garlic, what's nice to do is to use a mortar and pestle and squash the garlic in there with the salt, and that abrasiveness helps to chop up the garlic into really fine little bits.
Is a lemon pepper a hot pepper?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm not familiar with that, even working the fair with everybody bringing all their peppers in. And does it look like the hot peppers?
I will show you. I will show you. And yes, you did see, well, they were there last year because Cheryl entered some and won a ribbon.
Okay.
Yeah, they are hotter than a jalapeno.
Oh, okay.
They're
And they're little
I
guys.
do remember those. Yes.
Yeah.
They're about as hot as a serrano.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, this is just part of the stash that's sitting on the counter waiting for me to do something with it.
Oh my gosh.
Do they start out green and when they're ripe, they're yellow?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, so let's give this a stir over here and see how it's doing.
They are hot, but they also have a nice citrusy flavor to them.
All right, that's looking very good. Give that a little stir.
Hey, Marianne,
Yes.
are you sterilizing the lids too?
Yes.
Or you,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You sterilize the whole bit. Even though the food is not going to touch that band, I'm still making sure that it is hot because it's all going to be going on a hot jar. Okay.
you have lids in one of those pots too then?
This one has the bands.
Okay.
Right.
The lids now have not gone in yet because that was one of the things I learned when Cindy and I took that class online. It's better not to put the lids in first because you know, for a long time, because the rubber gets too soft. And that may ruin them. And what I do is there are 5 of them here, so I put them every other. When they're here all like this, sometimes they'll stick together. So I take them and I put back to back. What's going to happen, John, is when the water boils for the canning bands, then I'll turn the water off and put in the canning lids. So they'll all be in there and they'll all be nice and hot before they get put on the jars. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, now let's see where we are here. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit now about eggplant. The author of the cookbook first discovered this particular relish when she was in Australia. And then she found the secret to the recipe's flavor in an old cookbook that a visitor from Sri Lanka gave her. It was sauté the diced eggplant in a half a bottle of oil. Talk about not precise. And then mix in pickling spice. Okay, that's all she knew. It wasn't detailed at all. So she experimented and developed the recipe that we're using today. And the word brinjal in the title means eggplant in India, South Asia, and South Africa. And I didn't know that at first. And some of you know Sudha Haley, who sometimes came to our services, and she came to our Bible study. She is from India, so she's the one who alerted me to that. Now, eggplant is a high-fiber, low-calorie food that's rich in nutrients and comes with many potential health benefits. It can reduce the risk of heart disease and help with blood sugar control and weight loss. And eggplants are a simple and delicious addition to any diet. It's a member of the nightshade family that includes tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, tomatillas, Jimson weed, tobacco, and belladonna, among others. The vitamin and mineral content is quite extensive on an eggplant. They're a great source of vitamins C, K, B6, thiamine, niacin, magnesium, manganese, phosphorus, copper, fiber, folic acid, potassium, and more. So if you're on a high, you need to watch out for your potassium. Don't eat the nightshade family, which is what I went through last summer. They also have a large amount.
Only eat a little.
Huh?
Or only eat a little.
Or only eat a little, yeah. Eggplants also have a large amount of phytohormones that help treat premenstrual syndrome. And eggplants may cause acidity problems, therefore pregnant women should avoid eating them. But these issues don't apply to anybody who's watching today. Maybe somebody who watches it later off the website. Now, if you have big eggplants, especially the larger eggplant like I used at the beginning, sometimes it helps to slice and salt them ahead of time because that removes some of the bitterness and the excess moisture. But with Cheryl's, he grows out of our garden, I don't bother because we've never had a bitterness problem at all. It may just be the kind that he grows. And there's no shortage of ways to enjoy eggplant. It can be eaten raw, which I've not tried, but it's even more wonderful when it's grilled, baked, braised, or cooked and pureed into a dip. I like to broil some of our excess eggplant at the end of the season, and I broil them in the oven, of course, and then I put them on flat lids, like Tupperware lids, put them in the freezer when they're frozen, then I put them in a bag, label it, date it, all that good stuff. And they can replace noodles in any casserole you want to make, or be in addition to those noodles. The only one I wouldn't use it for would be Norm's eggplant parmesan. I prefer his method for that one. All right, so now we're going to put in the peppers and the garlic into our lovely mixture. And I like to use a bench scraper for picking all this stuff up. Makes it fewer steps. And we'll stir that in. And now it's getting more colorful since we added the red and the yellow. And this only has to cook for about 3 minutes now, but that's what it's looking like so far. You can see that the eggplant has wilted considerably. Now we're going to get the spices ready. I've already measured out the spices I'm going to use. And I had, which are also these, and it's in your little list there. And it calls for chopping up the coriander. Well, using ground. I almost always buy my spices whole, or I let our cilantro go to seed, and then I have the coriander seeds. So I am going to chop them up a little bit, but with the salt and mortar and pestle, just to crush them up a little bit. Kind of keep your hand over there so you don't have them flying all over the kitchen. And they don't have to be super chopped up. So in a couple minutes, we're going to put those in. I'm going to get rid of these rubber gloves because they're too hot, and I'm not doing peppers anymore. So fenugreek is an herb on here that you may not have, and as it turned out, I've used all mine. So what I have done in the past, when I don't have my fenugreek, is there are about 5 different substitutions you can find online if you don't want to buy the herb or you just have run out. And one of them is what we're going to do today, and that's adding whole mustard seeds, same quantity as the fenugreek, and add a splash of syrup. So I've got some pure maple syrup that's going to go in just a minute. And I've turned the water on under the lids because that's going to be important soon. Rather under the bands. Okay. All right. So we're going to throw in our seasonings. And stir them in. And precision is wonderful. It calls for a splash of the maple syrup. So we're going to use a splash. I'm not sure how much that is, but about a tablespoon is what I'm putting in. 2 teaspoons maybe even would be closer. And the herbs and spices in what you're making, whether it's tomato sauce or a relish, you can play with those for what you like. Like I said before, just don't change the ratio of the fruits or vegetables to the acid. All right, so I'll let that sit for a little bit. And then we add, oh, one of the things that I added, of course, is canning salt. Now, please do not use table salt, kosher salt, and the reason is because they have an anti-caking additive in them. And what that will do to your product is make it milky and murky looking and not very appetizing. But if you use canning salt, pickling salt, it's gonna look, you can find it in bags, you can find it in boxes, but that's what pickling salt, that's what you want to use.
Pure salt.
It's pure salt without anything else in it. Because you don't want, after all this work, you don't want your food to look unappealing, and also it has a very fine grain so that it dissolves very fast in liquids. Okay, now we're going to add our vinegar. Well, it calls for 3/4 of a cup, so I just added 1.5 cups.
Okay.
And we're going to add our brown sugar. And stir all that in. And you can hear that it's a little gritty. That will dissipate, that grittiness will dissipate as it melts into our stock. All right. So I'm going to skip ahead to talk about an ingredient that we're adding later, and that is pickle crisp. This is put out by Ball. That's the generic name. What it actually is calcium chloride, and it's very helpful when you're making something and you want parts of it to stay crisp. Now, eggplant's not going to stay crisp, but the peppers will, so you get a nice crispiness through your relish. A lot of people swear by it. I use it almost every single pickle I make or any particular relish I make, and that is, like I said, a generic name, the calcium chloride. Formerly, what people did who were canning was they would soak their vegetables overnight in a pickling lime, but then the next day before they actually made their product, they had to repeatedly rinse the vegetables to get rid of all that lime out of the food. Now, I've never personally done this. This is something like maybe our grandmothers did, but not me. And it doesn't take much of this stuff. In a pint jar, you only use a heaping 1/8 of a teaspoon. So we'll use half of that, a 1/16, for our little cup-sized jars we're doing today. There's another crisping agent that works really well, and that's grape leaves. And that's what I use when I'm making my cucumber pickles that don't require salt. And it just keeps them really super crisp. They're very good. That little vine we have out front has never made any grapes for us to eat, but the leaves are handy.
It's a wild grapevine.
It's a wild grapevine. Okay, so I'll give this a stir. Now at this point, I'm going to taste this to see how it's doing, to see if I need to change any of the seasonings. Nope, it's really good. We're going to let it boil a little bit longer. And our lids now, our bands rather, the water is boiling in that, so I can turn that water off and throw in all my little discs. And I will talk to you about things I have out here. If you're doing a lot of canning, a little scale is very handy. This one can be switched between metric and our pound system, which is very handy because you'll find cookbooks that have both. This, we're okay. This is a jar holder. It is a firm arc, Has little slots to slide your hand in. And when you're dealing with a hot jar, it's really handy. My hands are really not asbestos, and this way I can put the lids on more easily. I'm going to be using, somebody have a question? No, okay. I'm going to be using a canning funnel. I'm going to be using a magnet to pick up my lids out of the hot water. I'm going to be using this little tool. It's plastic. One end is going to be slipped between the food and the jar to make sure I get all the air out, because that's going to make a difference on whether or not your lids will seal. And the other end, if you can see it, has little grooves. And these are 1/4-inch steps, because you want to have a certain amount of headspace. And every recipe will tell you how much differential you need between the jar lid and the top of your liquid. So I'm meticulous about that. And the other handy tool is a wet cloth for wiping the lids. And I'm also heating water in my tea kettle, because the lids are going to have to be covered by at least 1 inch of hot water. And so that's why I've got this boiling, just in case I didn't judge right when I filled my pot.
That's after you have
After I had the stuff in it. Right,
yeah,
right.
in the jars.
In the jars, okay. So this is not quite ready. Oh, another thing I use, depending on what I'm making, especially for relishes and things that have liquid in them and a lot of solid, is this. I found this at a craft show. This is a wooden tamper. Now, normally it's used if you are making little pie tarts in your muffin tin, and you push your dough down with this, the big end if you're doing a big muffin, this end if you're doing a small muffin. Well, it's also perfect for tamping down whatever you're putting into your jar. That also helps you get all the air out so that you can have a better seal on your jars. So, all right. I'm going to take the jars out. Oh, the jars are going to go onto an insulated mat. You've seen these at bars, they're at cooking stores. They're just, you can use folded up dish towels too, that's fine. But you need something secure so that your jars aren't, when you take them out of the canner, are not going onto your cold cabinet, because you don't want the jars to crack. So, we're going to use our little lifter. Dump the water out of the jars and put them over on our mat. And we're going to keep this water still at a boil, because the jars are going to go back in the water. That's why it's called hot water bath canning. All right. Now, because I know that I'm going to be at least filling 4 jars from looking at my pot, I'm going to add my pickle crisp right off the bat for 4 jars, not the 5th. But it doesn't matter really at what point you put the pickled crisp in, so long as it's before you can the jar, but you close the jar up. All right, so handy dandy measuring cup. You can use a spoon, you can use whatever you want, but since I know that this is about a cup, it helps. So I've got my first ladle full, and I've got the funnel in the jar, okay? And fairly close to the stove. Well, I know from practice that when the food gets just over the bottom of the red part of my funnel, that's a 1/2 inch. And for our recipe, it just I go back and forth and check, even though I've made this lots, just to make sure it is 1/2 inch that I want for my clearance. Oh, and we have enough here for a 5th jar, so I will add some pickle crisp to this last one. And it looks like I should have put 6 jars in, but that's okay.
We have some refrigerators.
Yeah, the others will just go in the fridge. And part of that is a variation in how long this cooks, and part of it's a variation of this, should have been 1 pound or should have used 1 1/4 pounds or 3/4. Anyway, so what happens next? Yes.
I volunteer for the 5th jar.
Haha. Okay, so now I'm taking my little instrument. This is a hot jar, so let me hold it this way, just so I can show you. All right, I'm taking this plastic knife, in effect, and going around the edges of the jar to make sure there's no air, because you want to have as much food in there as possible so that your ratio is going to be right when you do your canning. And this is before I measure for headspace. Because if I'm taking out the air and it's getting filled in with food, that's going to throw off the headspace. So, what I will do now is take just a regular old spoon, and I'm going to measure each of these jars. That one looks good. This one could use a tad more. This one can use a little more. Yeah, that's too much. Don't like that. I'm going to go over there. You really do want to be careful. Like, I made some stuff this summer that I thought for sure I followed the recipe exactly. And I'll tell you more about that later. What a disaster. And that beeping means that the tea kettle has heated up extra water in case we need it. All right, so all of those are half of an inch of headspace. Don't need those guys. I'm going to take this though and move it because, well, never mind. I'll leave it there. Okay, but now I'm taking my wet cloth. I'm going to go around each jar a couple of times just to make sure that there's no spillage on any jar. Because if there's spillage, it's not going to seal. And these are definitely hot jars. Make sure it stays clean. This is not a cloth that I've used for washing dishes. This is clean as of this morning. You do not want, and I go around more than once just to make sure that there's nothing sticking on there. Okay. So then we go to our canning lids. They've been waiting here patiently, and I have my handy dandy magnet. I used to use tongs to get these out of the hot water. This is much easier.
That is so clever.
Well, Bowl's been doing this stuff for a long time, Martha, and they've got it down pretty well. So each one's getting covered. And we'll get some bands out as well. This little guy on the bottom is being stubborn, but he succumbed. All right, so now I go back to my non-asbestos hands and take my jar holder, hold the jar, and tighten the lid. Now, you only want to do it with hand pressure. You do not want to seal them super, super tight because the air has to escape. And if you made it too tight, the air is not going to come out. And then your jars will never seal. In fact, they might explode in your canner. Not a pretty sight. Only once have I had a jar break in the canner. And I didn't really start canning much until I met Cheryl because of the garden. All I used to do was make, I had a very tiny garden right before I knew Cheryl. I had plum tomatoes and basil and marigolds. For those of you who have seen our back garden, you know that we do a lot more than that now. All right.
Marianne,
Yes, ma'am.
how tight are you making them?
I'm just making it so that I can't turn it any farther, but not using the whole super bunch of pressure.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just do it naturally. Stuff.
Yeah, till it naturally stops, Cindy. Okay, now this lid's coming off again, and we will use our jar lifter and put these 5 in here. Now, the bottom of my pot, which I did not show you, has a plastic mat in here with little grooves, and those grooves are what hold your jars in place.
Okay.
And they are various size holes, so you can do quarts, you can do pints, you can do quarts. Half pints, yeah.
Jellies.
Yeah, these are jellies. Yeah, okay, so this is not as deep as it should be, so I'm gonna take this boiling water and pour it on top. Now, you don't pour it on the jars, you pour it in the empty space between the jars. And you want it to cover by at least an inch on all your jars, because you want the air to have someplace to go, otherwise it may explode your jars. So that is set.
And you want even heat. Is it?
Yeah, you want even heat, and that way you have even heat because it's boiling water all around it. Now, you don't start timing it until this comes back to a boil, which is why I had this water really hot before I put it in, to help shorten that process. Watch pot never boils. I know. So anyway, so we'll wait a little bit on that, and I'll tell you a few more things. Okay, we did that part. Now, if you're doing, in your recipes, it will tell you, depending on what size jar you're using, how long the processing time is. In the case of the Brinjal Pickle Relish, if you're doing pints, you have to wait 15 minutes. If you're doing half pints, if you're doing full pints, it's 20 minutes. Some recipes, it doesn't matter, and it'll tell you that. When Cindy and I took that class with Pennsylvania Home Extension Service, I asked them, well, if you want to use a different size jar, how do you figure it out? Is there a way to do that? And she said, if you can't find it in a recipe book or in or on the websites for any of the home extension services, don't use that size jar. So that's her advice. So, okay. Now, the reason we're so careful about all of this is because of the danger of botulism. Let me see if this is almost. It's a rare disease, but it's really serious, and it's caused by eating foods that are contaminated by a disease-causing toxin. Now, you can't see, smell, or taste this toxin of botulism, but even a small taste of it can get you really sick, and it can be deadly. Home canned vegetables are the most common cause of botulism outbreaks in the United States. According to the CDC, from 1996 to 2014, there were 210 outbreaks of foodborne botulism reported to the CDC. Of the 145 outbreaks that were caused by home-prepared foods, 43 of them, or 30%, were from home-canned vegetables. And these outbreaks occurred because home canners didn't follow canning instructions, didn't use pressure canners for low-acid foods, ignored signs of food spoilage, or didn't know how to get that they could even get botulism from poorly preserved vegetables. The best way to avoid botulism is by carefully following the instructions for home canning. And you can find that on the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning online. I personally, yes.
I remember from that class they said not to use old recipes.
Well, yes, I'm getting to that as well. You're absolutely right.
Sorry.
Well, that's okay. You go ahead. You tell them.
Oh no, if the old recipes might not be accurate and could give you botulism, so you need modern recipes.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Because our grandmothers didn't know as much about this as we did, and USDA didn't. So you have to be careful. All right. Well, this is now boiling. So Alexa, 15-minute timer. Some of the low-acid vegetables are tomatoes, green beans, beets. So I only do those. But green beans and beets, I only do in a hot water bath if I'm making them into pickles, because then you're putting in enough lemon juice or wine or vinegar to make them acidic enough to be safe. And as Cheryl said, some tomatoes are low acid. So all those recipes call for adding wine or lemon juice or vinegar so that you don't have to worry about which tomatoes are low acid and which are regular, which are high acid. Botulism usually starts with weakness of the muscles that control the eyes, the face, the mouth, and the throat. And it spreads to the neck, the arms, the torso, the legs. It can also affect your breathing, which can very often lead to death. So this is why I'm telling you what to watch out for so that you can do canning safely. Just follow the directions precisely. And as Cindy so aptly brought up, use a current cookbook. Don't use ones that are older, even maybe from the 60s or the 50s, because they just didn't know enough at that point. Okay, but now back to happier stuff. I never know what I'm going to be canning from day to day. It depends on what's coming out of the garden or what we might happen to find at the farmers markets. So basically, I just use what comes out of the garden, except when it comes to peaches, because there are a couple of really great recipes. We don't have peach trees, and so I'll get a bunch of peaches and make some great stuff. Well, the other day I decided to try a new one. It's from a book called Preserving Italy, talking about preserving peaches in grappa. Well, we like grappa, we like peaches, what's not to like? Well, this recipe made quart jars. So I made 3 quarts of it, and 2 of them didn't seal. And when I took them out of the canner, a lot of the liquid was gone. Don't know what I did wrong. 1 sealed. So okay, 2 are going to go in the refrigerator. It's like, okay, I've got more peaches. Let's try this again. Then all 3 of them didn't seal. Still no idea what I did wrong. But that put 5 quarts of peaches in grappa in the refrigerator. Now they're mostly gone because we've been eating them, but I was really looking forward to having those over the winter.
But I wasn't disappointed.
I'm so glad. Now, to keep track of what I have made, I guess maybe I'm too anal, but I have a spreadsheet that is several pages long on Excel. And what I have done, this is a little portion of it.
You may hold it closer.
Yeah, you want to hold it closer? Sure. Well, put it down, Cheryl. Okay, what it shows is the recipe, the cookbook it comes from, the page, major ingredients that aren't in the title, and when I made it and how much I made of it. Now, the things that are in red are the things we really, really like. So they're all at the top of my list. And you can, and this shows how much I've made of those so far this year. Move it a little bit, Cheryl. See, that way you can see where it has August, I made this much, September, I made that much. Okay, well, I've tried to keep all that organized. I'll take it back, honey. Thanks. I try to keep all that organized and up to date as I'm canning along. There's some even that I've marked that it won a blue ribbon at the 2019 county fair. That way, but with the county fair, they have a really strange system when it comes to canned goods, I think. Martha, I'm going to give this one to you especially to find out why. If you
I have never done canned.
well, no, but you might know about the judging and the judges and their rationale, because if you bring in cakes and cookies, they eat them, they try them, and that way they know whether or not they're any good. They don't do that with canned goods. They look at the jar. They look to see whether or not it's a new lid, a new band, and whether or not the band color matches the color of the lid. They look to see, to make sure the headspace is good. They'll turn it upside down to make sure it's got the 1/2 inch or whatever. But they don't open them to taste them. I'm very happy that one of my relishes last year won Grand Champion. But based on what it looked like and not on what it tasted like, I think that's a little strange. So anyway, Martha, that's your job. Ask them to change their system, because if they, well, they're not going to listen to me, but anyway. Okay. Oh, I also have on that spreadsheet tabs for things that I've made that are especially fermented, like when I made a okra pickle that was fermented, and that used the grape leaves again as the follower in the jar. And there are different tabs in my spreadsheet. Okay, on the cookbooks, as I pointed out, I write all through these. I put on the date that I first tried a recipe and what we thought of it. And then other little comments, like if I made 3 times the amount of eggplant in this recipe, it took 16 cups of julienne eggplant. And this is super with an exclamation point. That's why it's in red on the spreadsheet and it gets made every year. And then that same super comment will go in the back of the book, in the index, because when I have forgotten where I found a recipe and canning or just dinners or whatever, I like to be able to go to the index and say, oh yeah, it was in this book, and I've marked right here, caponata. There's a VG on that one. The cabbage Asian coleslaw has an OK. So I probably won't go back to that one again. So those are the kinds of comments I put in my cookbooks just to make future meals and relishes and such a lot easier. How are we over here? Okay. So we have 9 more minutes to wait on this.
Any questions?
Oh, now it's 8. Okay.
Any questions?
Oh, does anybody have questions as we go along? You've been good about asking so far, but we do have time.
I have a question about something else.
Sure.
You use the mask for peppers, which is a great
I do.
idea. Do you think it would work for onions?
You know, quite frankly, I've never tried it, but I don't know why not. That might, it wouldn't help the eyes.
Yeah.
It wouldn't help the eyes, but if you weren't bringing in the fumes through the nose, that might make a difference. Could, yeah. I know that if the onions are cold, like if I'm slicing up an onion that I've had in the refrigerator because I had half of it left, then I don't tear up, but I don't normally keep my onions in the fridge. So I don't know. Does anybody else know about onions and tearing? I've tried various things. Nothing has worked particularly.
Yeah, I've tried everything. Piece of bread in your mouth, everything.
Yeah. No, don't know. Don't know. Well, I will skip ahead to what's going to be happening a little bit. So when the timer goes off, I'm going to be turning off the heat underneath the canning pot and taking off the lid. I'm not going to take the jars out immediately. They need to sit in there to equalize a little bit on the temperatures, and that starts that little bubbling of some more air coming out. And then after 5 minutes of that, then I'll take them out of the canner using my handy dandy tongs and let them sit there. Now, do not be tempted to play with the lids. You're going to be rewarded very shortly with some nice, wonderful popping sounds. And that means that your cans have sealed. And instead of them being convex, they'll be concave, which is what you want. You don't want to play with them. And if you push down the lid, you don't want it to be artificially down, because if it's not canned properly, you don't want to be saving it. You don't want to help it along. Let nature take its course. That's Mother Nature's job. So that's part of the chemistry of all this. And all that goodness that you've got inside there, it's okay to eat it now, but it'll be even better after it ages a while. Anything that is left over, like what's left in the pot over here now, will go in the fridge. We can use that. I saved out some of this because this is the one that we opened the other day, and this is going to be great in a tuna salad at lunchtime today. I pretty much stopped, partly because of our working on losing weight. There is sugar in this, but it's not nearly as bad as adding mayonnaise to our tuna fish. So this is good for a tuna salad. It's great on a crostini if you have a baguette with some cheese and some pickle relish on top. It's great on hot dogs. It's great on hamburgers. It's a wonderful, versatile relish. Very, very tasty.
Another question.
Certainly.
If you the people that use a pressure cooker, is it faster than the boiling processing?
I really don't know that, Martha. You need to check with Cammie. But the other thing that it does let you do, it lets you do low acid foods, because inside a pressure canner, the water gets a lot hotter. This is going to go up to 212, what we're doing here today. It's not going to get any hotter. So you need that extra high temperature so you get rid of the chances of having botulism.
Okay, thank you.
Blender. Victory. Okay, we're going to put this on for 5 more minutes, turn this off, take off the lid, and let that continue. And so when that timer goes off again, I will pull back out of the hot water bath. And then you'll start hearing hopefully some nice pop. Ah, there we are. Okay, so let's see how soon we hear some pops. And I take, let's get this out of the way. Drips all over the place, so I usually put down a towel, make it a little bit easier, less of a mess. So this is Brinjal Pickle Relish. We have 5 cups. Now my database will record 6 cups because there's another cup worth right here in the pot. Also keep these totally upright. Don't be tempted to tilt this over to get that water off of there. Don't worry about that. It will evaporate and it won't take long because you don't want to affect the process. Then after those do dry, I have my handy dandy marker. I will mark the name and I'll put the date on the lid so that I know when I made this particular batch. And then of course, when it's in the pantry, I use the older ones before I use the newer ones. And I've tried to stack in the pantry. I have columns. So sauces are here and salsas are there, just like you would with any other food you have in your pantry, hopefully. Keep things a little bit organized so you can cycle through and use the older things first. So that's pretty much it. We may hear a pop yet.
We're just waiting for the excitement.
Have they popped yet?
They haven't popped yet, Martha, unfortunately.
Okay.
But you can tell by looking at them too. Right now, the lids are up.
Convex.
They're convex. When they go concave and they pop, that means they will be safe. You can label them. You can put them away in storage for a year or so. And something like this and other pickles as well. I find that if you leave them for a little while and don't open them right away, the flavors have a chance to meld and they taste better. But be creative. Look for different ways to use these things, either online or in cookbooks. It's very gratifying when you look at all those jars. They're stacked up right now in our dining room, this year's batch, so that they'll be ready to go in the pantry. Now there's a pop. We got a pop.
Oh.
I don't know if you did you hear that?
Yeah.
Good. 4 more to go. I think that's about it, folks. I guess that's a wrap.